And it's a great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for the inaugural lecture of our exhibition, Wayne Thiebaud, Art Comes from Art. I'm sure that you, like so many people, are familiar with Thiebaud's work. You've seen it at the De Young, you've at SF MoMA, in other collections, the Manetti Shrem Museum, locally. But I think what is really remarkable about this exhibition is that it really shows a facet of Thiebaud's work that many people have been totally unaware of. Indeed, I myself, it's only as Tim has really dug into this preparation of this exhibition that I feel he's sort of peeled back these layers and layers and layers of reference and meaning, sometimes profound, sometimes humorous, and really brings and sometimes both, really bringing a fresh perspective on this dearly beloved local artist. So thank you for being here. I'm thrilled we're opening this exhibition. You may not be in the habit of coming to the Legion 2 weekends in a row, but I do want to put on your radar that next weekend we have a cake party in tribute to Thiebaud. What better? A cake party, it's like a pop-up. We did one for the centenary of the Legion back in November, and we had 600 amateur bakers turning up with beautiful cakes. Apparently next Saturday we have 1,000 amateur bakers. So it will be truly a feast for the eyes and the palate. And the other thing I have to do is just remind you that the Thiebaud show is, of course, part of a really strong spring program. Over at the De Young, you have the ongoing McCartney photography show, and Eyes of the Storm. And then mid next month, we open our retrospective of the filmmaker Isaac Julian. And this is really going to be something to be seen. We're currently involved in the biggest rebuild I think we've ever done in our galleries, turning our galleries into multiple different screening areas for this amazing filmmaker's work. So it's a great spring. But now let's come back to today, to here. It's a real pleasure to introduce Tim Burgard. Tim really is the mastermind of this exhibition in multiple ways, because it's Tim's extraordinary knowledge of art history that I think has allowed him to kind of match Thiebaud almost like some giant card game, work by work, as he's kind of pieced together this vast range of reference in Thiebaud's head. Tim is has been the curator of over 35 exhibitions at the Fine Art Museums, the author of and co-author of more than 20 books. As a curator, he has pursued his strong interests in contextual, interdisciplinary, and multicultural studies. And this is truly the kind of culmination of that kind of wide-ranging thinking. I think that's it. Tim, come to the stage and tell us about Thiebaud.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Welcome to the Fine Arts Museums, and more specifically to the Legion of Honor exhibition, Wayne Thiebaud, Art Comes from Art. As Tom said, he was a much beloved figure here in the Bay Area. When he passed away on, sadly, Christmas Day in 2021 at the age of 101, having played tennis well into his 90s, which is why he lived to be 101, he was without question one of the most famous and influential American artists, but absolutely also one of the most beloved, due in great part not only to his wonderful, warm, engaging, and self-deprecating, humble personality, but also to an approximately 6-decade career as a legendary teacher. And that is one of the elements I'm most proud of with the exhibition catalog, is Eve Ashheim writing at length and with illustrated class notes by Thiebaud for his teaching practice. You know, we all say he was a lovely, wonderful, amazing teacher, but what did he teach? And the catalog really delves into that, which is really wonderful. So we all know that when we look out on especially Northern California, and I would also say a certain slice of Americana, I'm using the pun intended, sorry, couldn't help it, we really see this world through Thiebaud's eyes. And you all know that he became famous quite early. He was already 40, but he became famous in 1962, almost overnight, in Time magazine, acquired by major museum collections, when he had an exhibition at Allen Stone Gallery in New York City in 1962. And there, viewers could see an extraordinary and distinctly American cornucopia of delicious or sometimes dubious deli and bakery and diner foods, which had the ostensible appearance of a form of realism, but as we will see, and as you can also experience in the exhibition, these are very prosaic subjects elevated into the realm of fine art and transformed into very poetic evocations that mingle the sociological or anthropological, almost as if he's an outsider looking in when he actually is an insider. He actually worked in a hot dog stand in Long Beach when he was a teenager. He knows this world really well, selling Red Hots. But having that distance, creating that distance to look at who we are, what we do, how we arrange things, how we experience them, what we desire. And that's really what those works are about. And the other element that I would add to the sociological, and that's often overlooked, is the surreal. And I'll try to point out a couple of places. I think he's really not a realist artist. He's really, I would say, an abstract realist or a surreal realist, which sounds like a contradiction, but we'll dig into that a little bit. And following those great early works like the display cakes you see on the screen at the far left, he also delved into very powerful and enigmatic portraits, the vertiginous San Francisco cityscapes, the delta crazy quilt patterns of the Sacramento River Delta, then these incredible sort of sublime mountainscapes, and then last but by no means least, these very beautiful, poignant performing clowns in the last decade of his life. So I'm going to delve a little into each of these types, and they are represented in the exhibition. But I want to start here with the quote that really is the quote for the exhibition. It's on the back of the book. It's in the exhibition itself. I believe very much in the tradition that art comes from art and nothing else. Art for me simply means doing something extraordinarily well and doing it in such a way that it becomes rare, a tremendous achievement, and a human experience symbolically reduced to an essential prime number or example. I would also note that he famously, in hundreds of interviews, and I've read them all, and I've read all 70 books, he always refused to be defined as an artist. He said, I am not an artist, I am a painter. Now he said, now Berthe Morisot and Rosa Bonheur deserve the term artist, which is interesting. Rosa Bonheur was one of his first great heroes. So this quote really sets the tone and tenor for the exhibition. Art comes from art. It sounds vaguely affirmable and verifiable and sort of probably true. We sort of go to museums and walk through the galleries chronologically and do feel that from Vasarian on, people tell us that art comes from art, from masters to students and teachers and so forth. So that's good as far as it goes, but let's dig a little deeper. And then there are these quotes, which are much more explicit and less philosophical. Art is not delivered like the morning paper. It has to be stolen from Mount Olympus, like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. My world is one of crime. I steal from every artist around the world and try not to insult them at the same time. And by the way, he stole from his students as well, and he said so. And he said, I would give them assignments and then pick the best solution that my students came up with for my own work. It's kind of crowdsourcing, you know, and it's hard for me to think of artists who weren't influential on me because I'm such an obsessive thief. And when someone said, well, who are your 2 or 3 biggest influence, it would be closer to the truth to say 300 or 400 artists. I am a real visual bandit. So he's been telling us this for 7 decades of his life in all these interviews, all these books. But what has usually been cited are 4 or 5 or 6 examples, the same ones, which are all true, and actually, yes, these are sources sources for major works by Wayne Thiebaud. But as Tom suggested, when we all dug into this deeper, you realize the breadth and depth and extent of what he's really going to do. And I will touch on three major types that are mentioned in the film in the exhibition. One is just overt homage, overt theft, but also clearly a tribute to these artists. And I would liken them almost, actually I would liken them all to this, almost like Thiebaud leaving flowers on the grave of someone he admires in Père Lachaise or Greenwood Cemetery, take your pick. But it's a tribute to somebody, and he wants you to see the tribute. But then there's covert theft, where it's not immediately apparent. He's the thief, we are the detectives, and we have to figure out and discern and describe what he's doing. And the last one, which is sort of the most alchemical and magical, is where I call it intuitive transformation. He sees something great, something that's moving, inspiring, interesting. He steals it, he transforms it, and it becomes something completely different. And it's almost hard to discern the original source material. So before we dig into that, I just want to bring up this extraordinarily beautiful portrait of his wife, Betty Jean. This is his Mona Lisa. It's at the entrance to the exhibition. It's an incredibly powerful portrait. She's seated at a table, and right away, here we are with the surreal element coming in. I describe it as looking like she's at a table, looking at an art history book. It has drawings, as you can see, by Georges Seurat and Edgar Degas, and I think, interestingly, I would describe the Seurat, like so many of his great drawings, as being about light, and then, yes, shade and shadow. And then, of course, Degas is about line. So you have light and line, two, the most important components of all great art, and very important to Wayne Thiebaud's work, as you all know. And they're also monochrome drawings, whereas Betty Jean, although tamped down in tone and color and so forth, is very much alive and very real. The beautiful penetrating gaze, the pensive pose, the beautiful wisp of hair coming off her shoulder like there's a breeze blowing through the room. And what I would like to say about it is, formally, I would say she's basically seated inside the opening in a letter envelope. I mean, that is not enough space there for that human being, but he convinces us that it's real. And the more important point about this painting is something much more subtle than that overt theft, covert theft, or transformation, and it's this. It might be that Albrecht Dürer's archetypal image of melancholy, melancholia, one as he called it, which is a woman with a book in her lap and her hand to her head. You all walked past the Thinker, a few hours ago or a few minutes ago, and so you have another archetypal image of the thinker or the pensive or the melancholic person. And so this is one possible source, or maybe it's Ingres' portrait of the Princesse de Broglie, who very famously has a dislocated right arm that's coming out of her stomach. And where is Betty Jean's right arm, I ask, if this is such a realist portrait, right? So, and I also, Ingres is a little more coy, so you have just overt, oppressive melancholy, and then a lighter touch, so to speak, a little more coy for the princess. And then Degas' beautiful portrait of the critic and writer Edmond Duranty, surrounded by a sea of books, ready to drown amidst them, and is this Monsieur Casaubon with his life's work, all surrounding him and writing. And I don't know, is the thought he's thinking more, is it the summation of all the books around him that he's read or not read, or is it an original thought? We don't know, but this is an image about thinking. Pablo Picasso, very famously, his muse and model, like Betty Jean Thiebaud, who was also a great filmmaker and Thiebaud's greatest critic, he said, of his work. She has her hand to her head, she has a book in her lap, and this is a much more dreamy kind of portrayal. Picasso, as you know, often shows Marie-Thérèse Walter in a very dreamlike state and often sleeping, for that matter. Is it any of these? Maybe. Is it all of them? Possibly. But the real point is, this is the intangible part of art history. When Thiebaud says art comes from art, he may be a great thief, we may be great detectives, but you can't always discern or describe it. Sometimes you feel it, but you don't know where it comes from, and you'll see that's true for Thiebaud as well sometimes. So, in the exhibition, in addition to 65 original Wayne Thiebaud artworks, there are 28 copies, and you see two of them here in the split screen after the famous Corot painting of the bridge on the Narni River. One of the really interesting things for someone who was such an avid museum goer, almost all his copies and reinterpretations, outright copies and reinterpretations, are from books or magazines or catalogs or postcards. And I've seen some of these in the studio that were the source image. One source image was even a famous work of art on the cover of a cookbook. And so he's not actually going to museums and setting up his easel, which might be difficult if you're the world-famous Wayne Thiebaud and you would get interrupted all the time, even if you were allowed to paint oils in a gallery. But what he likes is the reproductions. You see on the left this beautiful still life of books. They're all indecipherable except for the bottom book, which is clearly Degas' signature, one of his greatest heroes of all time. And so he looked at these books, and then on the right is a class exercise. He told his students, bring in an art postcard and then paint a still life with the postcard, two-dimensional, and a three-dimensional object, and that's what he's doing here. And as the quote suggests, Thiebaud pointed out, it's sort of self-evident, they're just reproductions. They're just caricatures. And so the little funnel, which is probably a $1 funnel from a hardware store to pour turpentine or something in an art class or in an art studio, is actually more beautifully and more volumetrically, three-dimensionally rendered than the very unexciting overall postcard after the Sorolla painting you see on the screen. But one of the interesting things about reproductions is, yes, you lose impasto, you lose all the incredible shading and shadow and texture and all these nuances, but what you gain is a distillation of the image into a two-dimensional image. And so many Thiebauds, like the Betty Jean sitting in a letter envelope, are this compression and two-dimensional stylization or caricature of the works or objects or people that he's depicting. Now, for the copies, there are several things he gets from them. One is academic practice. We just showed the Seurat and Degas drawings in Betty Jean's book. He elevated drawing as the absolute cornerstone of all art practice. You had to know the basics and the fundamentals to become a master and create great works of art. So here you see this very large, very beautiful drawing after, in the upper right corner, Velázquez's famous Juan de Pareja, which at the time in 1970 when the Metropolitan Museum acquired it was the highest price ever paid for a work of art. But that didn't happen until 1970, and the drawing's from 1955. So he's doing it from a book. It was still in a private collection in England. And here you see all these anatomical details. I wasn't able to figure out if the others are from life or from other famous works of art. He even whited out one at the bottom that's a human head upside down so that everything would be oriented the right way. And he signed it twice, big block letters at the lower left in 1955, and then he's very proud of it. It's the largest drawing I've seen by him at the lower right, much later with his classic Thiebaud signature. So this is very much, I don't want to say like on the back of the matchbook, but master these fundamentals and you too can be a great master like Velázquez is kind of the tenor here. Now, Van Gogh was a very important influence. This work in the right is in the show. It's clearly inspired by the work on the left. Thiebaud's in Mazatlan, Mexico. He's on his honeymoon. He paints this very beautiful seascape. And he said he looked at Van Gogh, who already had an extraordinary sense of color, but it was the halation, the multicolored halos that surround every object or everything that's described that give them, as Thiebaud says in this quote on the screen, this inner life. I would like, meaning his painting, to create its own light, to create its own energizing force. So he is using his copies and his art collection as a source of inspiration and technique. And then here, you see a beautiful Picasso from this, Picasso on the left, he's just taking the central image of this neoclassical head. And then this wonderful quote, you copy artists to understand them, to channel them. It may not be your taste, it may not be your style, it may not be your sort of interest of the moment, but you can learn a lot. And so I remember trying to copy a Picasso bather, one of his very crazy bathers. She's down in a little bowl, her feet are here, her head is way down here, her breasts are coming out here, and I thought, geez, that's so ugly. So I just tried to copy it. I sat down 2 or 3 hours and realized what a strange, complicated thing it was. It brought you intimately into it. It excited me. So this is truly, communion with great artists, trying to channel their ideas and their sensibility in their work by replicating it. And then, of course, he just steals outright from certain artists. Here you are. You have Honoré Daumier's advice to a young artist with the art world sort of patriarchal figure. It could be a dealer, a curator, a critic, or an academician, professor. And the young student with his portfolio trying to get some advice and maybe some help and sort of a leg up on his career. And then you see Thiebaud's copy of it in the middle of the screen, which is in the exhibition. And then at the right, it's not immediately obvious, but when you sort of put them together, it becomes pretty clear that this man, who is a friend, Gene Cooper, who was organizing a Wayne Thiebaud exhibition at that moment, so he's a curator, so he is an art world figure like the older man in the Daumier, but he's also a student. because he started to study informally with Wayne Thiebaud. So he's sort of summarizing in one figure both sides of the coin from the original Daumier. And he's holding a little canvas, and signed on the back of the canvas is Morandi, the wonderful Italian artist that is in Wayne Thiebaud's personal collection. Now, the art collection, there are 37 artworks in the art collection on view here, and interestingly, a reporter asked him, so which of your works do you hang in your house? And he said, none. And he said, what do you mean, none? And he said, no, I have a Cezanne watercolor and an hang drawing. Why would I hang any of my own work, right? Makes sense to me, But what I would point out, you'll see the art collection in the show, is on the screen you have the Ang drawing, again, sort of the fundamentals like the Seurat and Degas, one of the greatest draftsmen in the Western tradition, and the kind of thing with the anatomical studies in the Velázquez. So you have the sort of traditional academic, but then you have Paul Cézanne, the great proto-modernist, or one of them certainly, the sort of grandfather of modernism when he has his big retrospective in Paris in 1906. And then Henri Rousseau, who was a self-taught artist. And this is typical of Thiebaud. He is willing to look anywhere and everywhere across the art world spectrum. He doesn't care about your training or lack thereof, or whether you sold a lot of works or had a gallery. I think Van Gogh very famously sold almost nothing in his lifetime. What he cares about is the work of art. He's very open-minded, and this is a perfect example. Wayne Thiebaud made cartoons during World War II while he was at Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento. He collected cartoons, and he drew cartoons. And here you see a beautiful full-page Sunday paper Crazy Cat drawing by George Harriman, who a lot of great artists admired. Picasso, de Kooning, Bischoff, Diebenkorn, and of course Wayne Thiebaud. And what he said here, as you see, is my work is closer to caricature than to photorealism. I'm a kind of painting cartoonist, as many critics will agree. There's very little information there, mostly silhouettes, very simple shapes, very, very reduced sets of conclusions. So he said once he was criticized by a critic, said, oh, he's just a caricaturist and a cartoonist. He said the critic thought that was a slam, but that was actually a compliment to Wayne Thiebaud. He said, yes, that is what I do, and that is part of what art is. He said, you could argue that the entire history of Western art, or all world art, are forms of caricature. And in a way, that's true. You're trying to discern a greater truth, and it might be different from what you actually see. And then on the left, Daumier, one of the great caricaturists of all time, who really dug into human foibles and human failings, and famously politics and other things, but just the human condition. Now, abstraction is a really interesting idea for Wayne Thiebaud. Here you see a beautiful Joan Mitchell painting that the family donated to the Fine Arts Museums, and then one of de Kooning's famous women subjects. And what's interesting about this is that you would think abstraction would not really be something Wayne Thiebaud would be interested in. But he said that all art, whether it's ostensibly abstract or ostensibly realist, is all about the same problems that a painter faces when they stand in front of a blank canvas. And he talks about how all his favorite artists combine some element of realism or representation or naturalism with some form of abstraction. And as he wonderfully says here, I suppose it would be silly not to denote the fact that painting is already by itself very abstract. And he had a very wonderful quote where he said, when you look at a Joseph Albers square, like the famous homage to the square paintings, it's a square. It is. It's a painting of a square that is a square. If you look at a painting of a horse by George Stubbs or somebody else, it's not really a horse. It's not really three-dimensional. It's two-dimensional. It's not the real thing. It's a caricature. It's a distilled idea of what a horse might be for that artist at that time, at that moment, with or without a model. And so this is one of the things that he really feels very strongly about. And Richard Diebenkorn is one of those artists that famously oscillated back and forth in his career from representational art, supposedly, to purely abstract art like the Ocean Park paintings. This is a study for an Ocean Park painting in Wayne Thiebaud's collection that you'll see in the gallery. And I only noticed this the other day when I was preparing slides for this lecture. This is a painting by Wayne Thiebaud donated to the Fine Arts Museums. It's not in the exhibition. And I just realized that I think he's looking at this drawing in his collection. And I know this is very subtle, but if you think of the ball here in the middle that the dog is jumping up in the middle for, to this collage piece of paper and the square in the middle of the Diebenkorn, and then look at these parallel angles, lines that you could see as legs, like the jumping dog, the double sort of horizon line that you see up here in the Wayne Thiebaud beach scene and so forth. There's a lot going on in these two images that I think have some resonance with each other, and whether you agree or disagree, if it's true, it shows the kind of sense of play, so to speak, very appropriate for the gambling dogs, that Thiebaud had in how he approached his work. So to get to the heart of the exhibition, the actual appropriations, of which there are 65 in the galleries, the obvious prototype here is Pablo Picasso, who famously did dozens of variations after Velázquez again, Las Meninas, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and then here on the screen, Eugène Delacroix's Women of Algiers. Now, when he did them, you will know or have read that in the 1950s, early 60s, he was completely criticized for these, oh, they're derivative, they're retardataire, he's finally lost it. Sure, he did some good things in the early years, but now he's really over the hill, and this kind of critique and criticism. Mind you, the painting on the screen by Picasso just sold a few years ago for $179 million, so it can't have been too much over the hill, but I don't know, maybe it was on the way to the bank or something. But, so this is the kind of work that Picasso felt he could dig into the past as a great master himself, dig deep, confront, and challenge. And that's why I love this quote. This is one of his tennis partners and artist friends. Wayne is one of the most competitive guys I've ever met. He's from Gary Cooper country. Ah, shucks. But there's steel underneath. And this is the thing. Picasso was famously that 24/7, right? Very competitive. And he's taking on the great masters. There's even a story about one day, late at night, Malraux, the culture minister, allowed Picasso to bring his paintings into the Louvre at night and hold them up and sort of compare them to the old masters, right? And you get to do this if you're Pablo Picasso. But anyway, but there's a very important distinction. When Picasso does this, he is part of that tradition. He was trained academically, as you all know, but he's part of an unbroken tradition. And then the tradition breaks, and it especially breaks with pop art. And I love this quote, I don't care too much for pop art. It's too close, I think, to advertising, which I think is better, which is very witty and bon mot. And of course, Wayne Thiebaud worked in advertising in the late 40s at the Rexall Drug Company headquarters in Los Angeles, so he knew what he was talking about. And he pointed out correctly, so much pop art is mechanically reproduced, silk screens, Ben-Day dots, derived from photography, often no paint application by hand. It's all done, again, with silk screens or other formats, and photo reproductions. And I think what he was missing there was that human touch, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think, looking at the Warhol of the Mona Lisa, this is now a break in the chain, that unbroken chain that Picasso was able to add a link to. And one of the things I think Thiebaud does, and you see it and feel it in this exhibition, is he reconstructs the links in the chain so that it's not a broken tradition. He wants not to look at these great works of art from the past with irony and detachment and lack of emotion, but with the opposite of all those things, with feeling and a sense of being moved by something and inspired by something and so forth. So. The turning point in his career as an artist, after he leaves Rexall Drug Company, he gets his college degree, not an MFA, but an MA, and then he takes a sabbatical year and goes to New York City in 1956-57. He said, I'm going to meet all my heroes. And he did. He met all his abstract expressionist heroes. He met Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Barnett Newman. He met the critics, Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg. He met other artists, who were of a younger generation. And here on the screen, you see this beautiful Willem de Kooning of his wife, Elaine de Kooning, the artist, and then again, the Ang drawing from Thiebaud's own collection, which was also donated to the Fine Arts Museum, and he was shocked. In the magazines he'd been reading, Art News or whatever it was, these are the take no prisoners, flame-throwing, radical, avant-garde, abstract expressionists who threw everything out the window and kicked history to the curb and started from scratch, right? And then he goes and meets them. They talked about Rembrandt and Ang and Vermeer, and it was shocking to hear Franz Klein talk about Vermeer until you thought about his work, and how shocking it was to hear de Kooning, like Fairfield Porter. It was interesting to hear Barnett Newman extol and be so ecstatic over the Mona Lisa and what he would say about it. This was a revelation, and it gave Thiebaud permission to do anything, and also not to reject history. Now, here's a perfect example, because I'm showing a Ang-like de Kooning a moment ago of his wife, which, by the way, de Kooning said, these drawings can drive you insane. You know, they're so detailed and so, you know, so perfect. But here's one of his supposedly abstract expressionist works. And a scholar, David Ampham, has pointed out, and I think very convincingly, that if you look at the forms at the right, you see a very biomorphic reinterpretation, abstracted, of the image of Diana seated there by the side of the stream. And so this work, as Lauren Pomore's essay in the catalog suggests, is very much being incorporated into these supposedly, again, tabula rasa, you know, abex works that have never been seen before in the world. But de Kooning, who's trained in Holland and then comes here, has those fundamentals, has that great academic drawing technique, and wants to take it further. He also asked for de Kooning's advice, and that's what you see on the screen. He said, Thiebaud shows him his paintings. This looks like the work of 100 people, and he said, don't paint the art world, and don't paint the signs of art. Paint something that you love. You've got to love something. It can be a brushstroke if you want to be. And then he says, and then when you start that, start looking for the best possible paintings from every historical period. And that's what Thiebaud does. And here's what he does the year he gets back. So this is kind of shocking for a lot of people. An electric chair is not the first subject that comes to mind when you think of Wayne Thiebaud. But he had just seen this Franz Klein in Franz Klein's studio, the bridge. It's kind of vaguely, I think, perhaps the Brooklyn Bridge, if you think of one of the towers there with the two Gothic arch openings. But it's an abstract painting. And Thiebaud comes home. This is the first time, one of many, where he takes an abstract image and says, I can come from the other direction. I can come from representation and head towards abstraction, and that's what he does here with this painting. But he takes de Kooning's advice to heart, and then he starts doing the kinds of subjects that we all know and love, like the half salmon here in 1961, the year before his big exhibition in New York City. And the prototype is pretty clearly the Manet, also the half salmon. Often the titles give you a clue, and often there's an Easter egg or clue inside the work itself. Here's Manet's beautiful, you know, roasted salmon and you know, bottle of Chianti on the table and some lemons to garnish it with, and a beautiful Chinese blue and white porcelain bowl with a blue rim. And then Thiebaud's looks more like an autopsy of this poor fish. And look at the blue rim. I suppose it's supposed to be like a deli tray or something, but you know, very antiseptic, very cold, and again, more like you'd see a mortician or something like that. But that blue rim is his little nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I'm getting this from, you know, from the Manet with the blue and white porcelain bowl. So food paintings are the first things that made him famous. I'm going to show several of those. Here you see the one that was on the first slide on the screen a few moments ago, the buffet. And, you know, I think there was a clear critique inherent in juxtaposing a very five senses overload, Manet, color, taste, sight, all these things, touch, with the very skimpy, somewhat sickly looking salmon that Thiebaud paints. Here it's almost the reverse. We all know there are tens of thousands of 17th century Dutch, Flemish, German tabletop still lifes. They're almost all, though, as if you were seated at the table with a raking view perspective. Almost none of them are a sort of bird's eye view or a standing view looking down on the table. But Van Holstonk, who you see on the top left of your screen, is an artist who does that. Also notably with a very large fish on a round plate in the lower left corner and a big ham in the middle. So again, Thiebaud is probably quoting here, combined with a different aesthetic, which is Gustave Caillebotte, the great impressionist in the late 19th century. This is about modern commercial culture of the kind that Thiebaud loves, where all of a sudden you don't just go in a patisserie and buy your cakes or pies or whatever they might be. They are put in the window for your delectation. So it's about consumer culture, street culture, visual culture, and again, looking through a window onto something like you would in a bakery or one of Thiebaud's other diners or delicatessens and so forth. I would also point out to the issue about Wayne Thiebaud, the surrealist. How big is that pineapple? Picture a pineapple in your mind or in your hands. How big is that ham in comparison to the pineapple? It's about 3 or 4 times as big. Is that really possible? Probably not. So again, this is Thiebaud having fun. And there may also, he's calling it buffet. We think of all the great buffets, all you can eat buffet. It's very American, especially that, I think, probably really insipid giant bowl of something that's at the top there. I don't know. Is that a bowl of mayonnaise that's about 2 feet across? I don't know. Are those canned peaches? I'm not sure. And I don't really want to know, right? So, but maybe there's an inherent critique here about American overabundance, which mirrors the 17th century Dutch Flemish sort of superabundance. And then here's the exact opposite, something pared down to the bare essentials. This is one of my favorite Wayne Thiebaud comparisons. He loved Giorgio Morandi, and he owned 3 paintings, a drawing, and a print by Morandi, and you'll see some of them in the exhibition. And he sometimes said, I sometimes put a Morandi reproduction up next to my easel while I'm working. And here you see 3 objects on the left, all nestled together, the one in the middle taller, and then this one lone object at the lower right corner. And he's doing it with parfaits, sundaes, and ice cream, and so forth. And I think it's very interesting and very moving because there's this feeling of, thematically, of inclusion and exclusion. And this is the great sort of insight that Morandi had himself and that Thiebaud loved about Morandi. He said, they're like actors on a stage. You can actually create little dramas, and you can actually impute to them feelings and emotions and actions. And I think this is worth thinking about when we look at Thiebaud's supposedly representational or realist still lifes. Think about the idea that they actually are actors on a stage and might have embodied in them some sense of emotion or feeling and so forth, that they are alive. They're not just lying there inertly. Now, the flip side of that is, these are another form of still life, human beings. At least that's how it seems with Wayne Thiebaud. Here is his very famous standing man painting. It's actually an artist friend, Gregory Kondos, standing there all alone in his suit. He looks quite uncomfortable. I described it as looking like he's being fitted for a suit and are in a police lineup, so not too happy, somewhat bereft looking. The prototypes are a clown painting, very interesting for Thiebaud's later embrace of clowns as a full series of 40 or 50 paintings. Where everyone, all his fellow actors probably are sort of partying in the background. He's standing all alone in the foreground with nothing to do, sort of inert and inactive and sort of neutralized, but still somewhat poignant, looks a little bit sad. And then August Sander, who Thiebaud loved and talked about, he said, he's so great. He just stands them up and shoots them. They're not doing anything. There's no action. They're just like documentary photographs that you'll think of later with photographers like the Beckers, for example. And so this is sort of the underlying something from the 18th century, something from the 20th century that combine. And then the other thing I would add here is the very, very famous novel, best-selling novel by Sloan Wilson, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. There is a little bit of a feeling here of someone maybe who's partaking of corporate culture and dressing up every day in their suit to go to work, and then maybe other possible combinations or interpretations when you look at the Watteau clown, who also has to dress up and wear a certain kind for a certain role. And the artist, it's actually a painter, Anton Reidenschneit, in the Sander photograph, like Gregory Kondos is a painter. Now, the bathtub has often been pointed out is perhaps derived from David's Death of Marat, the famous French revolutionary stabbed to death in his bathtub. And the source is actually Wayne Thiebaud's son, Matt, taking a bath at about age 7 or 8 or 9 with his arm hanging outside the tub. And there's a little sketch of this in the catalog. And then in the actual bathtub painting is Betty Jean, his wife and model and muse and the filmmaker. And that connection's always been pointed out, but what's been left out is the Bonnard. He often mixes and matches. And Bonnard famously, again, his wife was his favorite subject, and he did a whole series of these bathtub paintings where you're looking down into the bathtub with a sort of tilted up head. And they're very intimate, right? If you picture the Thiebaud, essentially the viewer or the painter is kneeling on the floor of the bathroom next to the bathtub, right? It's a very unusual and intimate portrait. But again, how wide is the opening in that bathtub? I mean, when you're in the gallery, it feels like it's about 10 inches or something like that. And is there a meaning or interpretation here? And when I look at it, she's sort of head back, eyes glazed, seemingly almost emotionless. Is there something about American culture in the early or mid-60s? Is there something about suburbia? Is there something about the role of women? Maybe. And then this one, which is the Trinity. This is Thiebaud's daughter, Twinka, the famous model. And it's interesting because it says supine woman, but she was an 18-year-old teenager when she posed for this painting. And a photograph that's in the catalog that the family provided, she posed in a black dress. So she originally had black dress and black shoes when she posed, which looked exactly like Monet's bullfighter in The Dead Toreador. Again, why is she lying on the floor? I don't know. Maybe it's a teenager moment. We don't know. Could be, could be not. But just a shocking painting, right? It looks like a crime scene to have this person lying prone on the floor. And then the quote, because he was asked several times about the things that people noticed, the bathtub, the supine woman. Were you thinking of that famous painting? Well, I don't know, maybe. Or maybe in the middle somewhere it suddenly occurred to me. Or not till I was done. And then someone said, oh my God, it's the Monet Dead Toreador, right? And I think this was the point about Betty Jean in the book. Sometimes artists don't even know. You're not ready as an artist, musician, or writer to see, understand, or remember something that you've seen or read or heard before until you're ready, right? And then you're really ready. But sometimes it's lurking there in your unconscious. And he did at least a dozen variations on Monet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. Here you see two. One on the left where the makeup girl is selling us things in a department store with an all-seeing eye on the counter in front of her, which is sort of interesting. And on the right, you see, it's actually, again, Betty Jean with the heart-shaped opening. Thiebaud often signs his paintings with a heart, as we know. And then she seems to be making up in domestic environment in front of a vanity mirror or something. But it's not a mirror because it doesn't reflect the objects on the table. So are we just sitting across from a table across from her? It's not clear. But here's a case where he actually overtly acknowledged to a newspaper critic that he was looking at the Monet as a source image. Now we get to the more subtle things. These are sort of the overt homage or theft that I was talking about. These are more like the covert theft, because at first these two paintings seem to have nothing to do with each other. You know, the dingy Parisian cafe, the woman with a glass of high alcohol content absinthe, the man with a glass of wine, looking sort of downcast at least, if not outright depressed, and sort of taking a break from their lives, which probably are not so great. This is one of their few pleasures. And then the Thiebaud, which appears to be at an outside barbecue, probably somewhere in the blazing sun, although where are the shadows? The only thing that has a shadow is her milkshake with the straw standing up in it. He looks like he's come from the office. Maybe it's 4th of July. We don't know. He's wearing a red, white, and blue striped tie, which is interesting. And they don't really seem to have anything to do with it. Yes, male and female couples. Yes, the woman wears a lighter dress and the man wears a darker suit. But what the connection really is the most important thing about the Degas, which is the mood, right? And this is, as I said, this is the sort of world weariness or ennui that can't be remedied by intoxicating drinks or by American fast food. And then to get to one of these points about whether or not Thiebaud has an editorial stance, here you see a very famous Degas painting, the man leaning against the door of a small bedroom, the woman partially unclothed, seated, turning away from him in the middle of the room. Is he blocking the door? There's a bed in the background. What's going on? We don't know. Degas didn't tell us. And there have been dozens of articles and books trying to decipher what is going on and linking it to plays and linking it to novels and all these things, and none of them have been successful, because probably what it's really about, it's a painting about nothing, or at least it's not a narrative that can actually be articulated and described. But you feel it, and you probably feel it more by not linking it to a specific source, right? And so there's physical tension, there's emotional tension, there's sexual tension, and so Thiebaud comes to the subject. You see the work on the right with the looming man in the background. Is it a man in the room or in the doorway? Is it a painting of a man on the wall, like the standing man? The Matisse, which is also a source for the dangling legs, and then I know you'll see in the gallery, Thiebaud's, the right hand of his model is bent or broken almost at a right angle, and so is Matisse's. And Matisse's is in the background of this painting, right? He's in the mirror that you see right there in the reflection, so there's a male figure in that room also. But I think the real point, he says, purely formal problems always been what's most important to me. I try to downplay subject matter, because I'm afraid it limits how people think about pictures. And that, in a nutshell, is part of Thiebaud's philosophy. He does not want to tell you what to think. He wants you to experience the work of art. Now, the city paintings. Thiebaud openly acknowledged Richard Diebenkorn is the source and the inspiration for all my city paintings. And here is a direct homage with the road that goes vertically 2/3 up the hill, the high horizon line, the houses lining the street, and then and the diagonal coming in at the right and to the lower left. And very tellingly, again, a little giveaway, Diebenkorn on the top of the hill has the shadows of 2 church steeples. And Thiebaud has shadows of all these very tall churches and apartment buildings, none of which are actually on that side of the street. Where are they coming from? They just sort of materialized out of nowhere. But it is very much a sort of homage to Richard Diebenkorn, as are works like this, the sort of vertiginous city paintings we were describing earlier, where Richard Diebenkorn is in Ocean Park, Los Angeles, And as Thiebaud says in the quote, when you go down to his studio, which Wayne Thiebaud did, you start to see, oh my gosh, so those are the sidewalks, and that's the asphalt, and that's the line of the beach, and that's the horizon of the ocean. You feel these things have been sort of, taken into Diebenkorn's work, as he says, in an oblique way. And Thiebaud comes at it the other way. He sort of abstraction that might be figurative or representational. Thiebaud is representation that is completely made up, but that feels like it might be slightly abstract. He did sketch in the city initially, and a lot of people say, oh, I know where that is. That's out in the avenues, or that's in the Mission District, or whatever it is. But what he did was actually he started pencil sketches, realized they really weren't very helpful, and just went back to the studio and made it all up. So, and then here's a really wonderful sort of city painting. Pierre Bonnard, the very famous Breakfast Room. There are several versions of it. This one's in the Museum of Modern Art. He loved and said he loved the sort of inside-outside with the intervening plane of the picture window or the door or the glass. And so he picked up on that, and also Elmer Bischoff picked up on it, I think, for this Interior with Cityscape from 1969, before Wayne Thiebaud starts doing these huge city paintings. And then Window Views on the far right is sort of Thiebaud's version of this inside-outside with this extraordinary city. It's a huge painting, 6 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and down in the lower right corner is this gentleman having a lunch. He might be holding a menu, there might be one on the table, it's not clear. He looks like he's alone, there's not another chair across from him, and it absolutely will remind you, again, like the Degas, the mood of Edward Hopper's, like the automat of the woman late at night with the glass picture window, like the Thiebauds, like the Bonnard, the reflections, the inside, outside, but very importantly, psychologically, emotionally, all alone, and how it feels to be in an enormous city with no people, or to feel alone psychologically or emotionally. Thiebaud, when you look at his city paintings, we all know and love them, they're often cars, and there are never people on the streets, so it's very interesting. And then here's even getting what I call that intuitive transformation. This, of course, is one of the famous Degas hat shop paintings. We had it here at the museum. We had the millinery exhibition. And very famously, the hats on these very thin rods and stands sort of float up to the picture plane. This is what Thiebaud loves about Degas, is that sense of abstraction that he's able to acquire, that he talks about in the quote. And then his display cakes. And I think this is intuitive transformation. He sees and feels this incredible painting by Degas, and no, they're not hats, they're cakes, but they have that same sense of sort of being balanced on these thin rods that, again, make no sense whatsoever in terms of gravity or support or anything like it, or in terms of reality, because why does the biggest cake have the smallest shadow? That doesn't really work that way, but, and he's again sort of, belying what we think is real or natural or representational and so forth. And of course, they're all consumer goods, right? And like the pastries and so many of the other things that he paints, they're presented to the viewer for our delectation or our desire. This one is probably the farthest out there on a limb we can go, or on a string or something, pick your metaphor. This is the extraordinary Cakes and Pies, again, about a 6 by 5 foot painting, just extraordinary, powerful, beautiful. And he kept saying in these interviews that he loved Juan Sanchez Cotan's paintings, and I could, well, why, how? I don't understand, I'm not seeing it. And then I realized, I think this is what it is. Cotan is famous, it's his signature for suspending his still life objects from strings. And I think that idea of suspension and tension and defying gravity, in a sense, is really what Thiebaud is doing with these cakes on thin rods and stands are. So conceptually, if you turn the Thiebaud upside down, you would have objects hanging from strings in the same way, just visually or conceptually or formally. And I think that's really what he's doing, is the magic of painting to suspend not only our sense of what's real and not real, but also our sense of gravity or other things, like in the city paintings. And this one's really fun, because how could you not be fun? Wayne Thiebaud doing cupcakes at many times of day, sort of funny, just like Monet did haystacks or grain stacks at different times of day. And this is, of course, one of the things we all know and love about Wayne Thiebaud and his work. He loved what he was doing. He was having fun, right? And he wants us to have fun too. He takes his art very seriously, but he also wants everyone, including his students, to have some fun when they do it. Now, very interestingly, he did tackle contemporary art and contemporary work. So here's the small study for the 4 pinball machines that you see on the right, which is one of his largest paintings ever, 67 by 72 inches, so life-size, basically, for pinball machines. And the ones on the left in the little study look like numbers and wheels and stars and things you'd expect to see maybe on a pinball machine. But the ones on the right don't. And the ones on the right, the backing boards don't look like any pinball machines any of us have ever seen. So what is he doing? This is one thing he's doing. He is critiquing contemporary art forms. This is 1962. This Stella painting is from that same year. So this is the year Wayne Thiebaud becomes famous. He's in New York for his exhibition. He has exhibitions almost every year after that at Allen Stone Gallery in New York, and he does what we all do. If we're in New York, we might have a reason to be there for business or pleasure, and then we go to the Metropolitan Museum, or we go to the Whitney, or we go to MoMA, and that's what he did. So he saw what Frank Stella was doing in the early 60s, and he's creating a little riff on it. And he tells you, here's the Easter egg, there is a star on that machine, and the Latin word for star is Stella. And so he's like, this is the Stella, right? You know, so, and then Kenneth Nolan, who's famous for his target paintings. Again, this one had just been completed in 1962, the same year. It could be Jasper John's targets as well. And in both cases, I want to call out the sort of anthropomorphic elements of these supposedly inanimate machines, but they have legs. You know, and they have this sort of round head-like form, they have handles, and, you know, there are ways that a lot of artists conceptually thought of machines and human beings sometimes sort of fused together, and I think that might be going on. And that when you're Ken Nolan, I'll say, oh, you're the target guy. You're the one who did the targets. Oh, Wayne Thiebaud, you're that cake and pastry guy, right? You know, like you get sort of tagged by your most famous work, and it makes it hard to even sort of move on from there. And then the third one, I think, is older. A lot of the famous artists you might think of hadn't done their grid works yet, like Saul LeWitt or other people, Agnes Martin and so forth. It's probably Ellsworth Kelly, but it doesn't matter. These are types. These are types of geometric formal abstraction that was at the peak of the art world, had sort of kicked ABEX to the curb when Thiebaud arrives as a now famous artist. And the last thing I want to say about it is if you zoom in, which nobody has ever talked about, on the playing field, as it were, of the Frank Stella pinball machine, there is a death's head and crossbones on it, which is pretty shocking, and it's never been mentioned. And so he talks about this kind of formal abstraction and says you always run the risk of getting into some kind of terminal style, one that anticipates itself, so like a dead-end style. So very appropriate to have dead-end style to have this skull and crossbones. And then about abstract art. So he loves abstract art, he collects abstract art, and he made abstract paintings his whole life. And none of you have ever seen one, I'm sure. He never would show them. They're all hidden away in the family and the foundation. And that is very telling that they're non-objective abstract paintings. Not abstracted, but actually non-objective. And so he respects it, but he's also a critic, right? He has limits, he has parameters. And that's where he's saying, when I look at Frank Stella, I don't know where I am. I see I'm looking at some stripes, they're very beautifully done, have a powerful impact. Exactly the kind of impact we look for in commercial art, which Wayne Thiebaud did, when we're looking for design that captivates us. These refinements are very important, terribly important, but they don't inquire after the human position and the concept of empathy. These are crucial for Wayne Thiebaud. So this is very, very interesting. And then the next year he does one more riff criticizing sort of modern art, abstract art. Here you see children's boxes, like little toy boxes or cubes or, you know, building blocks. I think there's a witty pun here about boxes being cubic, that cubism is sort of the foundation of 20th century modernism. So they are cube-like boxes. But they have imagery on them, like the upper left is like the Delaunay paintings, the Orphism with all the beautiful planetary sort of orbs, Kandinsky for the top middle with these lines and vectors and circles. On the front of the back two boxes on the front are these sort of blams and blooms, and, you know, that Roy Lichtenstein did in his comic strip paintings, right, with explosions and so forth, and Vroom in this case. And then, of course, again, Frank Stella front and center in the foreground. So it's very interesting because it shows Thiebaud's sense of play, but again, remembering Picasso, his sense of competitiveness as well, I think. So same year, 1968, he probably saw this Ellsworth Kelly at an exhibition in New York City. It's huge, 96 by 96. The Thiebaud is almost as big, so he's trying to match him almost one for one. And he comes back in 1968 and paints this painting. And again, I think he's taking the challenge. He respects Ellsworth Kelly's work, but he's saying, I can do a sort of representational version, which does really speak, like the city paintings, to our experience of the California landscape and these ridiculously sort of 45-degree angles and hills. Or here, very funnily, very wittily, it's a box of ties. But he actually said to a critic that a group of new subjects has pop resonance, women's hats, men's ties. He hopes to introduce color field concepts into the representational idiom. And the giveaway is that they're cut off at the bottom and the top has the ragged edge like Morris Louis when he pours his stripe or drip paintings. And this one is really fabulous. So Ellsworth Kelly donates this huge, huge piece, multi-panels, each of them 84 by 34 inches, takes up an entire gallery wall in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969, and Thiebaud in 1970 responds very critically and telling it with pop bottles, when, as you know, Thiebaud very famously said, "I am not a pop artist, I've never been a pop artist." And then here you have Barnett Newman, one of the people he met in New York City in 1956-57 with one of his zip paintings with the vertical stripes, then rode through at the far right, which reminds me, and I'm sure a lot of you, of going up, and before you go over that last hill into LA, right, the Grapevine, that's so steep they have pullouts for the trucks that lose their brakes and so forth. So again, very much a California experience. And Martin Ramirez, self-taught artist who was institutionalized in Central Valley hospitals for most of his life, and Wayne Thiebaud went and visited him and said how struck he was by his singular vision. And again, because he didn't care where art comes from, he cares about what it is and what it says and how you feel when you look at it. He's sort of mixing and matching these two things. Now Ramirez, as you see from the title, is actually 3 VW Volkswagen buses climbing a hill, so it actually does have cars and roads in it. And then this is one of my favorites, Frank Stella. I remember when these came out, radical, outrageous, people were upset, or they loved them or they hated them. There was no middle ground. These three-dimensional constructions of the type we had here during the Frank Stella retrospective a few years ago. And Stella said in interviews repeatedly and in the exhibition catalogs, basically that if painting isn't dead, it's pretty close to it, because I can't do what I want to do anymore with a mere canvas. So he comes off the wall into these sort of sculptural constructions, which, by the way, he vehemently claimed are still paintings. He said, but these are basically sculptures, right? No, they are paintings. So it's sort of interesting. And that argument now might not hold up so well, gravitationally or otherwise. But Thiebaud said, people say painting's dead. Fine, it's dead for you. I don't care. Painting is alive for me. Painting is life for me. And here, I think he's saying, okay, I'm hearing what Frank Stella is saying in these interviews about painting is almost dead, or it's no longer useful or productive. You can't do what you need or want to do with it as an artist. And he's basically doing these freeway paintings, say, yes, you can. And I just did, right? I mean, that's an incredible recessive perspective. Also, the vertical picture plane that was so important to formal abstract artists like Frank Stella. Now, to head towards the end of the exhibition and the talk as well, Edward Hopper's very famous last painting that he completed, knowing he was getting old and would soon die, which he did, taking a final bow on stage as one of the most famous artists in the United States at the time, in 1966, with his wife, Jo, who was indispensable to his work and to her own work as well. And he's gesturing to her in thanks, as you can see. And so very poignant, very moving painting, an artist's last public statement, basically. And the painting on the right, by the time Thiebaud gets into his 90s, as is often the case when you live that long, you begin to suffer great loss and tragedy. So in 2010, his son Paul of Paul Thiebaud Gallery very tragically died. I think he was 49. In 2015, the very same year this clown with red hair is painted, Betty Jean Thiebaud dies. And so, unlike Edward Hopper, who has his soulmate on the stage with him, he is alone. He's not performing. He's standing there in the spotlight. He is a public figure, like Hopper, Thiebaud, one of the most famous artists in the country or around the world, and he has nothing to say or do or perform. He's just there. He's just still alive and still existing. And then the last self-portrait, 100-year-old clown, painted in the year he turned 100 in 2020. And the wonderfully moving, poignant, he's actually still got his sense of humor, because a lot of people, one scholar in particular, has suggested his hat, it might be one of his mountain paintings, which I think it is, and that the stripes of his windbreaker might be like the asphalt with the striping on them, going down vertically, like the vertical city street paintings. But the source and the giveaway, here's the Easter egg or the sign or the symbol, is his little red clown nose. Thiebaud loved clowns. When he was a teenager in Long Beach, he said, when we were little kids, the circus came to town on the railroad. If you carried water and things for the elephants and the other animals, they would give you free tickets, and you could talk to the clowns and meet the acrobats and all these things. So this is where his great love of the circus and clowns begins. And so there is this retrospective, nostalgic element of the whole clown series of 40 or 50 paintings. But the giveaway is Burgard, who also did a lot of great late self-portraits, but he has a little red nose too. And that's the telltale sign. But Burgard has got his fists up, he's pugilistic, he's ready to take on any and all comers, especially really horrible critics, and he's still got a lot of fight left in him. Thiebaud, very movingly, is sort of diminished down in the lower in the picture plane as if he's sinking down, suffering the weight of the personal, emotional, physical tragedies, and just getting older. His eyesight was actually failing towards the end of his life, and he's really ready to exit stage right. I mean, it's a very powerful, very moving portrait of the artist at age 100. So to finish, I just want to point out several general operating principles for Wayne Thiebaud. He's about one world of art. He said, since there's only one art world or one painting world as far as I'm concerned, referring to California painting is like referring to California mathematics or California science, which is really a great quote worth remembering because we hear it all the time. And he used to say, poor Dick Diebenkorn, oh my God, they kept calling him a California artist, and he's just a great artist, and he loves Matisse, and he loves world art, and so forth. And he said in Germany, Holland, Flanders, England, China, India, Japan, Africa, Pacific Ocean areas, list is endless. People are producing art of great stature and masterful beauty. He truly took a global view, and this is a Wayne Thiebaud globe, as you can tell. And really, that you had that view from the very beginning in the 1950s. Now, the other is a sort of sense of time and timeless communion. This is a detail from a painting. The clock is signed Thiebaud, from a painting of a student in a classroom. Many history of art books point out the evident need for stylistic change. We will show every possible manner of artistic expression has the right to exist. Each style is equally important. That's from his MA thesis in 1953. And he's saying all these ideas about sort of Darwinian evolution and progress and art always gets better and we've reached the final sum non qua of art, and so he says it's all ridiculous, you know. And he says the fabulous quote: "You can do art history backwards or forwards. You can take your choice. Progress is not part of it. Variation, yes, and extension and all that, but progress, few. I don't know how you beat any of that stuff, even from the cave period." Right? It's a great quote. Artists sort of know this intuitively, but the art world and the art market, especially now, put a lot of pressure on people. I remember reading a letter from Joan Mitchell's New York City dealer in 1964, "Send me everything you've got. I can sell every painting you send me. It's already sold. I've got a waiting list." And this was George Stampley Gallery, I believe. And Joan Mitchell wrote back, because I saw both the letters, and said, "I'm done. I've done everything I can with that thick, goopy paint, slathered on house paint and so forth, and I'm not going to do something just to sell them. I have to do them because I want to do them and feel them and mean them, right? You know, so, and the other important thing about this is if you believe that art transcends time and place, all art is contemporary. All art was contemporary once, even if it was a Rembrandt or a Leonardo or Artemisia Gentileschi or whoever. But once you look at the world that way and stop thinking about progress and evolution, then it's all available to you, right? And so that was what Thiebaud did. And then community, you know, the sense of communing with an artist like the Picasso that he copied. I think we have a misconception about where painting comes from. It's not a hermetic activity. It doesn't come from an individual. It's a communal, commemorative, very layered activity, like the Medellin Thiebaud with the multiple possible sources. I guess one of my quarrels with modernism is the emphasis on the so-called self. I'm not sure we have one. The idea is to become one with others, to surrender your private, selfish self to something bigger than you are. I think the charge and responsibility of painting really is to merge with your tradition, to respect it. So when he does 35-cent masterworks on the screen, these aren't just targets for theft. This is actually his family tree. These are actually the artists he reveres, that he feels a sense of communion and kinship with. And then to end, bringing painting to life, he had this fabulous quote. It's about television, but seems very applicable today. "Television comes out at us, so do signs and advertisement. The world is just all coming out at us. We passively accept it's the action, and we're just here. Just going through life interrupted by a series of nervous thrills." Sounds like social media, doesn't it? "It's easy for people to say painting is dead or irrelevant. It isn't lively like television or film or drama or music. It's not in that world. It's a flat, silent world that you are responsible to bring alive. And it's there for you if you want it." Now, we're living in very challenging times, and I think some of these issues may prove to be temporal, and others may prove to be more lasting. And I think, for example, we're living in a technological age, and we love the things technology can do for us, or I wouldn't be able to give this lecture right now. I'd have old-fashioned slides. But I think we also worry that it's sometimes inhuman, and sometimes even perverted to being inhumane. And so this is the double-edged nature of technology throughout history. And at its heart, and you remember how Thiebaud often signs his works with a little heart signature at the bottom, his works, I think, epitomize the ideals of humanism and the realities of what it means to be human and to feel as a human being. And I think the portrait of Betty Jean we were looking at, I mean, it's important to remember, this was in this world of technology, that beautiful portrait was created by a human hand with a human heart and a human brain. And you feel when you stand in front of that painting the love and care and empathy for one particular person, but then you feel the love and care and empathy that we all feel for another human being. And I think that very enigmatic portrait of Betty Jean doesn't really tell a story per se, but it does make you want to write one. And I think it's moving, it's melancholy, it's mysterious, it's magical, and it's there for you if you want it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I am happy to answer some questions if anyone has them, and there are a couple of mics here in the aisles if anybody wants to delve deeper into the mysteries of Wayne Thiebaud, which I may or may not be able to answer, but
When should I go? I'm curious if you could speak more about your research for this exhibit. I think that, I'm curious about how you made these connections in the show and in the catalog. For example, like Thiebaud's dogs with the Diebenkorn. I would never be able to think of that specific Diebenkorn, but when you put them side by side, it makes so much sense. Yeah. And so I'm curious, if it just comes to you from your experience as a curator for many years, or how you were able to make all these connections.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and a lot of people wonder that, and with good reason. So, I have all 70 Thiebaud books above my desk. I have 300 articles also on my desk that someone very nicely photocopied for me or printed out. Thank you, Kelsey Chung. Wayne Thiebaud is a thief, and we are detectives. And what we do in the exhibition, the catalog, or in this lecture, I think, is present a case as if you were an attorney in a courtroom. You make a case, you present evidence, mostly visual, sometimes textual with quotes. In the end, it's really up to you and everyone, every viewer, to decide, right? It's either a convincing, compelling case, or it's completely full of holes and you completely disagree. Although, when people have disagreed, like, I don't see the Juan Sanchez Cotan things hanging from strings and the Thiebaud cakes, I'm just not getting that or seeing that. One thing I would add is in a museum context, when you are a curator, or if you're an artist showing in a gallery, Thiebaud said once, you're thrilled when anyone notices your work at all, right? But the other half of that is people are engaged. They're actually agreeing, disagreeing, qualifying, and that's sort of a win for everybody, including Wayne Thiebaud. The other answer is, if you absorb all those, you have to do your homework. So you read all the books, read all the articles, especially the interviews. I had separate files just for the interviews and read them multiple times. You begin to know how many times he loves Edgar Degas, right? Someone, what would you want on a desert island? The person or the works? Oh, the works. He said, thank God, because the person was the nastiest human being who ever lived, and the answer was Edgar Degas. But he said, but the works are amazing, the works are great, right? So the answer Tom somewhat referred to at the introduction is, every artist, every art historian, all of us have visual data memory banks, and I suggested ways in which they might be less obvious and more subtle, that things are lurking back there that we don't know. I'm going to use a horrible example. I shouldn't do it. But there were multiple decades-long lawsuits, for those of you who are musicians, over whether or not Led Zeppelin stole the intro to Stairway to Heaven. The answer is yes, by the way, as someone who loves music. But they actually lost the case. This is a band that opened for Led Zeppelin with that song, but anyway, another story. And I actually believe there are times when artists, musicians, and writers really don't think they stole something. It's a little bit like Thiebaud, like when does something really come to your forefront of your mind, like the dead Toreador of the Manet, and when is it just lurking somewhere in the back? And we've all been in that position, like, I had this great idea, and then someone says, someone else already thought of that, right? And so, but basically it's that visual database. I just looked at every Thiebaud in all 70 books. I even went online to the auction records online, looked at every Wayne Thiebaud that might have been off, not in a book, and just tried to think, what in the history of art does that look like, with the help of Wayne Thiebaud saying, I love Manet, I love Daumier, I love Degas, I love so forth. But I failed miserably at his constant references to Chinese painting, Japanese art, and I'm saying art including prints, and Persian miniatures. Now, he said Dick Diebenkorn collected Persian miniatures, which he did. I did know that. And so the high-keyed colors in some of his Sacramento Delta Valley sort of crazy quilt landscapes, I think that's from seeing Dick Diebenkorn's Persian miniatures and then looking at them on his own. He talked about going to the Met and seeing the beautiful Persian miniatures in the Met, where he could sit at the table and look at them. So he had a great story, by the way. Dick Diebenkorn is showing them Persian miniatures, and he's like, it's so beautiful. He said, I love that green. And Dick Diebenkorn's yeah, I added that. So he actually repainted a Persian miniature, but anyway. So that's the basic answer. So.
Hi. I'm curious, in this portrait of Betty Jean,
Yeah.
is the book a real book, or did he choose to juxtapose those two images? I'm
not sure. He has an extensive library. I did look through it for French drawing books of the 19th century, that kind of thing. I couldn't find something soon enough, and couldn't spend weeks and weeks on that one thing. My guess is it's made up. That would be my guess. He's picking two of his heroes and juxtaposing them. And there's a wonderful sort of trinity or tension or triumvirate there of Betty Jean is the muse and model, but Degas and Seurat are pretty great, right? And when I showed 35-cent masterworks, he ended up owning works by half the artists on that rack of museum reproductions. So,
Thank you so much. It was a fabulous lecture, and the exhibit is fantastic. So many artists, so many male artists. Did any woman artists influence Thiebaud?
Yeah, so as I said early on, he declined the term artist and said, I'm a painter. And he said, now I reserve the word artist for Rosa Bonheur and Berthe Morisot. I did look, of course, to see if I could find a reinterpretation of a work by Berthe Morisot or Rosa Bonheur, and I didn't find one per se. He also collected, he has an original Rosa Bonheur study for the Horse Fair at the Met, is in his personal collection. He owned the Joan Mitchell, he had an Elaine de Kooning, so he did collect women artists' works as well, and had many women artist students. And the other thing I would point to, there's a YouTube video of Wayne Thiebaud standing in the Metropolitan in the gallery with the giant 25-foot, whatever it is, Rosa Bonheur Horse Fair. And I recommend watching it. It's probably only 6-7 minutes, and it's fabulous. It's the first work of art he ever was aware of at the age of 7 or so, because his grandfather had a reproduction of it. So, yeah.
Speaking of aging, thank you very much for this presentation. It's wonderful. I learned a great deal. I am curious his relationship to the students at UC Davis and his colleagues. Can you amplify a little bit about that?
Sure.
In the relationship, what did he learn from them, and how was their reaction to this?
That's interesting. I can't think offhand per se what he learned from them. He was older than a lot of them. He's born in 1920, so he becomes famous when he's 40. All the artists, including Mike Henderson, who was interviewed for the video and other things, said that Picture UC Davis or anywhere where you might have been if you're old enough in the 1960s and what college campuses were like. And Wayne Thiebaud comes in his jacketer suit and his little bow tie and sort of like a button-down guy. And class started at 9 o'clock, he locked the door, and if you came at 9:01, you didn't get in. He was very much like, you have to take this seriously, and if you don't belong here. And so there was a little bit of opposition, I think, to the freewheeling UC Davis aesthetic and way of life, lifestyle. There were lots of great parties at UC Davis. But I think consistently, he really felt that students owed it to themselves and to their ancestors, as it were, their artistic ancestors, to take what they were doing seriously. The essays in the catalog, as I said, Eve Ashheim in particular delves very deeply into his teaching practice, and with illustrated notes that are reproduced in the catalog. And a lot of it is the fundamentals. That is the most important thing. But one of his students was Bruce Nauman, and those of you who know his work, it's highly conceptual work, and he says Wayne Thiebaud was an extraordinary teacher because he didn't tell you what to do, and I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but we've all had the experience of an art professor who perhaps never achieved the results or the height or the fame that they might have liked, or the market for that matter, but try to force all their students to do what they do or did. And I think Wayne Thiebaud wanted everyone to find their own path, but Bruce Nauman said he was always encouraging. He would find the thing to say, even if he was critiquing your work, that ended up being ultimately affirming and encouraging. So. Great. Oh, yes, no? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the show.